What's up, Patriots? Welcome back to my little series on constitutional rights, which essentially is designed to teach you about how to access and defend your human rights against tyrannical attacks by the government, forcing you into statutory recognition and then making you beholden, if you will, to a bunch of rules and regulations, like paying fines when you're parking on the street, like filling out the census or any other government document for free without getting paid, like restrictions on hunting and fishing, like restrictions on operating your business, taxes, obviously, being forced into the military, forced injections like you had during COVID-19. Human rights effectively invalidates the authority that governments rely on to force you into a situation where you're required to comply with things like that because you have absolute rights. Those absolute rights trump the authority. And we're going to look at the process now about how they basically remove you from your full legal capacity as an individual, and they now shift you into another capacity, a limited capacity, which we call statutory recognition. The taxpayer, the driver, the hunter, the spouse, the student, the patient. There are thousands of these things, and it's up to you, the person. It's up to you to basically be able to identify and then rebuke these claims that the government is making to effectively exert a certain measure of control over you. So, without further ado, let's get into the Constitution Act 1867. All right, we've covered this stuff before, but we'll go over it again here quickly. We've seen this court judgment here, the authority of Parliament in relation to the upper house, that was released in about 1980, right, from the Supreme Court of Canada. And it says, further, although Section 91 gave the Queen the power with the advice and consent of the Senate and the House of Commons to alter the Constitution of Canada, except in certain expressly designated areas, it does not confer the power to amend the B&A Act, which is now the Constitution Act 1867. Furthermore, they say the word Canada in Section 91 does not refer to Canada as a geographical unit, but refers to the juristic federal unit. Okay, and this is very clear. So if I jump over here to the Constitution Act 1867, they're basically saying that the Canada here that they're talking about, and you can see that right here in Section 4. Okay, they're saying unless it's otherwise expressed or implied, the name Canada shall be taken to mean Canada as constituted under this act. Notice, under this act, not according to the dictionary, not according to whatever your thought is. The word Canada means whatever it means to this act. And they just basically told you that it's the juristic federal unit and not the geographical area. Okay, good to go. So now we understand we're dealing with a corporate entity, and you can see it even further. Look at corporate entities. They use executive power. And the executive government authority over this corporate entity is hereby declared to continue to be vested in the Queen or the King. Notice down here, 15. The commander-in-chief of the land and naval militia and of all naval and military forces of and in Canada, the corporate status here, is hereby declared to be continued to be vested in the Queen. The commander-in-chief of the Canadian military is under the power of the King or the Queen. And this one up here is the one with respect to incorporation. Now listen, this process you see here under 14 is this process is replicated by ministers, and they're going to do the same thing. What the Governor General does, who is the Queen's representative, and we'll look at this in a minute, they represent the Queen's interest, not yours. But the Governor General here can appoint any person or persons jointly or severally to be his deputy or deputies within any part or parts of Canada, right? And in that capacity to exercise during the pleasure of the Governor General such of the powers, authorities, and functions of the Governor General as the Governor General deems it necessary. Notice this, deems. I love that stuff, right? So Let's just get this clear. They can appoint any person, and so can the ministers. Okay, the governor general appoints the persons to be ministers. The ministers then turn around, take the same power, and appoint you, the person, into an office in this corporate entity, and we call that incorporation. Okay, the incorporation factor allows them to do this function of appointing persons into offices in any part or parts of the corporate entity Canada. So that pretty much wraps up my little splurb here on the Constitution Act 1867. A very, very important document. There is a lot of language here. Look up the word dominion. Let's look it up right now. I wrote it out here. Dominion, legal definition. Again, in legal terms, dominion refers to the right of control or possession over something, such as property or a territory, and can also mean sovereignty over a nation or people. Get that into you. It encompasses both the right of property and the right of possession or use, meaning you can either possess it or use it, and use it, if you will, and it also encompasses all property rights. So they possess your property. Do you understand? They can operate and use your property because you are now under their dominion. Okay? And you can see they're even citing Canada, New Zealand. There's Australia, of course, the UK, all of them. Right? Now, listen, while the Crown theoretically has the power to revoke or alter the letter's patent, and we're going to look at this stuff next, it remains unclear to what extent that power remains after the enactment of the Constitution Act 1982. And if you watched my video on the Free Democratic Society, we went over Section 52 of the Constitution Act 1982, which invalidates all the statutory authority granted to themselves under the Constitution Act 1867 by way of Section 91. And if we just jump back to this here, you can clearly see that, let's see, 91, keep going. They have the right to make laws for all of these things: patents, inventions, copyrights, naturalization, marriage, divorce, interest, legal tender, weights, measures, bills of exchange, promissory notes. Note this one here. That's a big one. Banking, right? Everything. Taxes up here, which is essentially under 3, right? And of course, down here under 92, a same deal. Now, the provinces or your state also has a bunch of legal powers that they can do, right? Incorporating companies within the province or the state, you know, the establishment of a whole bunch of different nonsense. They have an insane amount of power. And of course, direct taxation, another one. So I think you're starting to see the situation here is that these powers are only pertaining upon classes of subjects. In this case, the people appointed into offices within the corporate structure that is the Dominion of Canada. There it is. Now let's get into this letters patent stuff. All right, let's get into this incorporation stuff. Essentially, we've established that Canada in the Constitution Act 1867 does not refer to the geographical unit, but refers to the juristic federal unit. And that is further echoed in the Governor General's Act under Part 1, where you can see that the office of the Governor General is a corporation sole. There it is, right? The Governor General of Canada or other chief executive officer or administrator carrying on the government of Canada on behalf and in the name of the king or the queen, the sovereign in this case, by whatever title designated, notice they just designate the title, is a corporation sole. So there's literally no sort of argument that can be made that you're not talking about the corporate entity. You have corporation creating an office for the Governor General by way of the Constitution Act 1867, and that office in and of itself is another corporate entity. And that process just trickles down the statutory chain until it hits lowly little you. And then they do the exact same thing. They appoint you, they designate you, they deem you as a corporate entity. They force you into an office, and then they basically say, now you're subject to all the rules, regulations, and all the rest of that stuff, the duties and obligations with respect to whatever the office is. If you're the taxpayer, Well, you have all of these ones. If you're forced into an office with respect to some sort of corporate, business structure, then now you're operating that office, right? All these things is you're an officer operating out of an office inside this corporation, which is ultimately governed by the governor general, who does the queen's business or the king's business, right? So under the criminal code, you can see in the definitions, municipality includes the corporation of a city, town, village, etc., the inhabitants of which are incorporated. So the inhabitants there, that's the first big one, right? So if we jump over here to this court case, which is Agnew v. Ontario, you can clearly see that the judge says under paragraph 8, while the inhabitants constitute a body corporate for the purpose of the Ontario Municipal Act, they are not the corporation. Do you see that? The inhabitants constitute a body corporate, but they are not the corporation. The municipality, when incorporated, forms a separate and distinct identity from its inhabitants. Do you see that? And then he quotes this law of Canadian municipal corporations, in which the author, Rogers, says, while the Ontario Municipal Act defines city, town, village, township, or county to mean respectively those things, the inhabitants of which are a body corporate, and then states that the inhabitants of every, county, town, village, and township are a body corporate for the purpose of this act, suggesting that the inhabitants are the corporation. Notice this, suggesting that the inhabitants are the corporation. This is clearly not the case. The corporation is legally distinct from its inhabitants and is a separate legal person. Notice that. They are legally distinct. Therefore, the inhabitant and the legal person created by the incorporation process are not the same. They are not the same, which gets you into this language here, body corporate. You saw it in the Municipal Act. You saw it in the Criminal Code. Well, I included a link down below in the description box for the logistics page for the Government of Canada, if you will. Logistics just means the language that they use in various bills. But look what it says here under the terms body corporate and corporation mean exactly the same thing. Oh, okay. Well, why not just use corporation, of course, but body corporate? And then they go on to say stupid stuff like body corporate is archaic as far as a term. Never used, although it's in the Residential Tenancies Act. It's in the Municipal Act. It's in dozens of acts. Okay, right? But most people don't realize that the term body corporate means exactly the same thing as a corporation. And here's the really important one. Jump down here to this Black's Law definition where it says body corporate, C corporation. And then it says an entity, usually a business, but not always, having authority under law to act as a single person distinct from the shareholders who owns it and having rights to issue stock and exist indefinitely. That's one version of a corporation. Another version of a corporation is a group or succession of persons established in accordance with the legal rules into a legal or juristic person that has a legal personality distinct from the natural person who makes it up. Notice that. A group or succession of peoples, okay, persons, in this case, the Free Democratic Society, okay, built up in accordance with legal, not lawful rules, legal rules into a legal or juristic person, meaning your property, the juristic person who can take on legal personality, the driver, the patient, the student, the taxpayer, whoever that is legal personality. And your juristic person is the entity in law attached to your body physically that can now take on all the duties, responsibilities, and obligations. Like if you were to get into a contract and all the rest of that stuff, that is the operation of law, but it is distinct from the natural person, right? It exists indefinitely apart from them and has the legal powers that it has been granted to it under the Constitution. Okay? Again, down at the bottom here, it says company one, a corporation, or less commonly, an association or partnership. Again, you're going to see this terminology from the last video where I talk about the definition of a person under the Residential Tenancies Act, and you will absolutely see association and partnership in there under the definition, including the corporate entity. So there it is, man. They're basically letting the cat out of the bag. And you can see the operation of law up from the Agnew v. Ontario. The inhabitant and the corporate entity are two separate things. They are distinct. They are not one and the same. They are two distinct legal entities, meaning Article 1 comes into play, the right to self-determination. Will you be the corporate entity, or will you remain in your full legal capacity as the inhabitant, as the individual, as the natural person, as the case may be? Very, very, very important to understand that the very simple distinction there. But there's a couple very simple sort of examples demonstrating and them telling you straight out. Remember, this comes directly from the Justice Canada website. This isn't some rando website. This comes directly from Justice Canada, and they were the ones that put the Black's Law 8th edition stuff in there with respect to corporations, not me. Now, why do you think they did that? Because they had nothing better to do? Of course not. They were basically forced to put this in here, which is ironic as hell, honestly, because I've read dozens of court cases where judges get all absolutely in a tizzy when you start quoting Black's Law Dictionary, because clearly it says that the language being used in the court and plain English are two completely separate things, right? They mean a lot more. Notice there are multiple definitions here for a corporation, but 99% of people would just assume a corporation is just a company. No, it's not. It can be a group of persons organized under legal rules into a juristic person that has legal personality. That means that they can now apply all of these rules and regulations, and you just get back into this original document with the Criminal Code and the Municipal Act, right? And of course, still in the Municipal Act, body corporate, the inhabitants of every municipality are incorporated as body corporate. Done. Notice here, the next one here, 9. A municipality has the capacity, rights, powers, and privileges of a natural person. Okay, right. So now they're basically showing you their hand. Well, if a municipality can be either a natural person and has all the rights, privileges, and powers of that natural person, well, that means you can remain as the inhabitant and not be incorporated as this body corporate. Or even if you are the body corporate now can operate with the same powers as a natural person, meaning all of your rights are now still intact. So even though they incorporate you into the municipality, the rights of the individual remain. And you can cite this here, the powers of a natural person, to make your argument pretty compellingly. Now, as far as the control stuff is concerned, this is where you get into the Business Corporations Act and essentially the Financial Administrations Act, CF12, right? So under the Business Corporations Act, notice here, subsidiary body corporate. For the purposes of this act, a body corporate, notice, again, body corporate from subsection 4 of the Municipal Act, the inhabitants of every municipality are incorporated as a body corporate. Now under the Business Corporations Act, it's saying for the purposes of this act, a body corporate shall be deemed to be a subsidiary. And notice the word deemed here. Go look that up. It doesn't mean that they have the legal authority to do anything. It just says they point at you and they're like, you're Mickey Mouse today. That's it. To be a subsidiary of another body corporate, but only if it is controlled by that other body corporate. So the body corporate, the larger one, the Federal Juristic Unit Canada, can deem you to be a subsidiary. That's what they're saying. First, they turn you into a body corporate using this. Then under the Business Corporation Act, they deem you to be a subsidiary of their corporation. Then you can see that under the Financial Administrations Act, that public entity means a corporation with or without share capital that is not a Crown agency, but is owned, operated, or controlled by the Crown. Do you notice that? And look at public officer. Taking up space in a public office includes a minister and a person employed in a ministry or public entity. Okay? So they're basically telling you straight out that a person can be put into the capacity of a public entity. That public entity is now a corporation with or without share capital that is not a Crown corporation, but is owned, operated, and controlled by the Crown. Okay, so they're saying the public entity, you, this corporate body is now being forced into recognition as a public officer operating out of offices from the major corporation, which is Canada, just like the corporate office of the Governor General. Notice that. Just what I said. Canada deems you to be an officer in an office by way of the Business Corporations Act and the Financial Administrations Act. They say, oh, we're just going to deem you to be a public officer. And now that public entity, which was incorporated, now is required to follow all the rules and regulations. And if you don't, they can start applying criminal action against you, or they can apply statutory action under the Municipal Act or any other act. And that in and of itself is the entirety of the incorporation process. Now, listen, there's way more. There's way more, but I don't want to go too deep into this because this is more academic than anything. I've shown you the most important parts. It's up to you to basically go copy some of this stuff, track it down, and then do what I did here, which was try to put it out. This is an older document from when I did it before, so it's been revised a little bit. But you can start to see my thought process here. First, it's established in 1980 that Canada is a juristic federal unit. Then in 1985, they say, oh, well, the office of the Governor General is a corporation sole. And then they say down here in the Financial Administrations Act and the Business Corporation Act that any body corporate shall be deemed to be a subsidiary of that body corporate, in this case, Canada, and controlled by it. Right? And now you become a public officer, operating out of a public office by way of being a public entity. Okay? And that public entity here, of course, now is entitled to hold property collectively for the public purpose, for a public purpose, meaning that your property now is apparently under the control of the government. And of course, what is part of your property? That's right, the juristic person that we looked under, the logistics stuff, which you can see again down here with the logistics, right? It's awfully clear what they're saying, especially from the Black's Law one, the legal or juristic person that has legal personality. That's exactly what they're talking about here. So it's all very straightforward. And I don't think it should be too confusing for anybody to see this process, even though it seems wrapped up in a lot of archaic language and stuff like that. Effectively, what you have is the individual existing in a geographical area, whether that's the municipality or Canada, the landmass or whatever it is. Then they built a parallel thing. In this case, Canada, the corporate entity. And then they create offices within that corporate entity. And then they basically incorporate you into the corporation itself, Canada, right? Using the Municipal Act, using the Criminal Code, right? And then afterwards they say, we're going to now control that corporate entity by way of the Business Corporations Act and the Financial Administrations Act. Done. There it is. Bing, bang, boom. Now, I'll say it again. Essentially, they have the right to do all of this stuff. Of course they do. They can make laws for anyone under their jurisdiction. But what they can't do is this, deem. You see that? They cannot deem you anything. What they can do is seek your consent. And deeming somebody circumvents the consent part. Therefore, a violation of Article 1, Article 4.2, Article 8.2, and Article 16, and you could even say ostensibly Article 22. Done. So there's incorporation in a nutshell. Start on your own process and look for these operations of law. The incorporation operation of law. The seizing of control operation of law. The forcing you into an office as a public officer operation of law. This is them forcing you now to play a statutory creature. Public officer could be anything, meaning yes. And see, that's employed by a ministry or public entity, and a public entity, of course, is a corporate entity that is controlled by the Crown, and they're deeming themselves to be in control of you by the Business Corporations Act. It's backwards, I get it, but there it is. So put your thinking cap on, understand, again, with respect to the video on legal personality, with respect to the video on the free democratic society, the inhabitant, the individual, the natural person, they are not the same as a body corporate that is created from them. They are separate and distinct legal entities that have different rights, different responsibilities and obligations and duties vis-a-vis which status you'll recognize in a court of law. And that's what happens. You go to a court of law, they automatically assume you're going to be a public entity, and the rest is history. So if you don't go in there and you're like, well, I would rather remain in my full legal capacity as an inhabitant or as an individual or whatever it is that they're using, you'd use this terminology, the inhabitant here. They've substituted this in for individual. Okay, so if you were like, oh, well, I don't want to pay you this, I don't want to give you any money for this permit to build a deck on the back of my house because I'm good and I don't need a permit that costs $5,000. Well, when you go to court, you're going to be like, well, why can't I just remain as the inhabitant? And then, of course, you're going to cite the lawsuit and be like, clearly, these are two different and distinct entities. So who's granting the state the power to force me into recognition against my right to self-determination? And there it is. Legal argument, finito. That's a 2-page lawsuit, and you win almost automatically. And of course, you can always cite the powers of the natural person and be like, I shouldn't even have to go to court in the first place, which will allow you to go after them for even more damages. Because you're like, now I gave you the sort of the out, if you will, the impetus to allow me to ignore this completely. It's not just Section 52. You're like, under the Section 9 here, right? If a municipality, this body corporate, has the powers of a natural person and they can exercise rights and powers that are granted to the natural person, well, then I don't have to pay attention to anything to do with this body corporate. I can remain as the inhabitant, which clearly has all of the rights and powers of the natural person. Of course, a natural person, a human being, inhabits something because we have needs, food, heating in Canada and stuff like that, accommodations, clothing, all of that stuff. People need that. Corporate entities do not. Therefore, there it is. It's as simple as that. Ask yourself, which one of these things actually consumes resources, if you will? The body corporate, some sort of legal entity, or the inhabitant? And there it is. You're like, okay, well, it's clearly not the body corporate. And there they lay it out even more for you, like the natural person. Oh, okay. So a municipality, which it's like reverse engineering their stupid legislation. It's ridiculous. Oh, the municipality now has all the rights. And of course, that's just it. Because if you think about it, they're almost can make the argument that any city, town, village, county, township, parish, or other territorial local division also has the powers of a natural person. So it goes both ways, right? Not only do you still have it, but they have it too, because they're telling you right up here, municipalities, and that's the word they say. A municipality has the capacity of a natural person. And they're telling you that the inhabitant is incorporated to mean municipality. Done, right? The inhabitants of every municipality are incorporated as a body corporate. Oh, okay. Meaning you become a municipality in and of itself, a body corporate within the municipality, carrying on business as an officer within the office within this municipality. In this case, the taxpayer or the resident or whoever it is. So you're going to have to wrap your mind around it, because there's literally 60 ways from Sunday to basically get at this information. And it really depends on your scenario. But that's why it's so important to really read through this stuff closely and understand what it is exactly that they're talking about. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself up the creek. End of video. I don't know what we're going to do next. I'll have to take a look at my little list here, but it'll be a surprise for next week or the week afterwards. So dive deep into this stuff. Start to create your war chest by collecting up all this information, especially if you're in Canada, and then start to formulate some basic ideas. Of course, near the end, I'm going to go through the entirety of my Declaration of Understanding and Claim of Right, where there is tons of examples, but I don't want to do that until later, because there's so much information. If I do it now, you'll just be completely lost. Incorporation, done deal. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you in the next one.